Hello, welcome to Brain Club, the podcast, a space for learning, unlearning, and reimagining new ways of being together in neuroinclusive community. I'm Dr. Mel Houser, Executive Director of All Brains Belong Vermont. Welcome to our brand new podcast. Brain Club is All Brains' full weekly community education program where we demonstrate our approach to neuroinclusive culture through community panels, guest speakers, and book chats. It's a place where we shift broader community awareness about the issues of concern and importance to neurodivergent people in our community and promote new ways of thinking and being in community together. It's a place where we transform culture by modeling what's possible with the idea that then you go out into the rest of your lives and carry it forward. You can already access all the recordings from our website at allbrainsbelong.org, but our community asked us to turn it into a podcast, so here we are. These conversations are not medical advice and they're not support groups. They're an invitation to think differently about health, connection, and how we build systems that include everyone. Each episode features community panelists sharing perspectives and lived experiences. We hope you'll listen with curiosity and reflect on what it brings up for your own life. In this episode, we talk with Dr. Laura Lewis from the University of Vermont and members of her research team about a new study on the healthcare experiences of autistic adults with multiple chronic conditions. You'll hear what participants shared about being dismissed, misunderstood, and harmed by clinicians and healthcare experiences, and you'll hear the patterns that emerge across these stories. This is part one of a two-part conversation that holds space for the pain and also for the possibility that if we can name the harm clearly enough, we can begin doing things differently. Content warning, this episode includes discussion of healthcare trauma, ableism, fatphobia, and discrimination. Please take care while listening.
Hi, I'm Laura Lewis. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm an associate professor of nursing at the University of Vermont. And I was the principal investigator on this study, meaning that I was the lead researcher. So this study we came up with in collaboration with Dr. Houser to look at the constellation of intertwined medical problems that we've been calling all the things and start to look at what it's for people who are living with all the things. So we used a participatory action approach, meaning that we had community members and autistic people on our research team. We had a really great team where we're really lucky, and we met to go over from the very beginning of the study what it was going to look, what our research materials would look, what our participants would actually see, and what kind of questions we would ask them. And then our community partners were with us all the way through data collection and data analysis. So really interpreting the findings that we had and understanding and making sense of the data that we collected. So we interviewed using online methods and virtual interviews. We ended up doing 30 interviews with autistic adults who had at least 3 health conditions or health concerns. And those could be self-identified. They didn't have to be formally diagnosed by a provider. And then we took those stories and we really tried to make sense of what those experiences were for people and take away some findings that might support clinicians trying to care for autistic adults that are experiencing multiple health concerns, and hopefully also support autistic adults themselves in making sense of their health experiences.
How many people experience something physiologic in response to something that happens, and they go in and they tell their doctor? And I think what the participants in this study said is that the doctor did or said something that led the person to conclude, this person does not believe me. That, if I were going to sum up the whole thing and pick one thing, so just for professionals to be aware that this is a widespread national trend, that autistic people are coming in and describing what's going on in their bodies, and they're having the experience of something that the professional is doing and saying that results in them feeling not believed. What do y'all think about that?
So I'm going to go ahead and go if that's okay. And it ties in really well with the example that we were just talking about, my nausea, because what typically happens is over the summer, I wind up having a really bad time with nausea. When I've gone in and talked with my doctor about it, the medical assistant would brush it off saying, you were doing a lot of gardening last week. And I'm sitting here going, no, this is a long-term issue. This has been happening periodically for years. Trying to have a conversation with a provider who is hearing my communications at an acute level rather than understanding that there is a very long-term pattern associated with this. And even when the long-term pattern was identified, nothing was done about it.
Classic example. I'm so sorry that that happened.
I feel one of the things that really stood out to me in a lot of these stories about being believed or not believed was felt as a nurse, there have been times that I've, even in some of these transcripts, I read things that didn't match what I learned in nursing school about the way that something works or the way that the body functions. And it triggered something in me that thank goodness for this team, I feel we had a chance to unpack, where I felt myself have a sense of, well, that's not how that works. And I feel what this team brought to light in a huge way is the importance of understanding and making space for realities that may not match your own experience or the way that we've been taught to understand a body system or how something works. And that really is, to me, bridging the double empathy problem. And I think the other piece that came out of this was so many people talked about not having words or language for their experience. And so they did the best they could to get that language so that they could bring it to a provider, but they didn't have years of medical school to interpret and understand the language fully. So then when they brought that into a provider, they may have used a phrase differently or used a different word or something that wouldn't match the provider's perception of how that's supposed to look. And it may have ultimately thwarted their efforts of trying to communicate with a provider, where then the provider may have dismissed it because it didn't logically match the provider's understanding of that same content. And that was something that was really interesting for me from a healthcare lens and how we make sense of what patients tell us.
I'm just struck with what Zeph says also and I don't know how to bridge this with providers or not, because but that challenge between the providers focus on the acute thing and also their assumption that, there's also this assumption that I don't know much about my body. And so they're explaining to me this thing on a really simplistic terms that I've already thought about 100 times and ruled out. And so it's already an immediate disconnect between me and the provider that telling me something that, if it was the first time I was seeing somebody about this issue, it might be interesting information for me to test out. But by now I've heard it 20 times and rejected it 20 times and been in pain about it 20 times, about it not working for me. And so this is that what I'm bringing to you is a long-term issue of how do I understand why this thing started for me 20 or 30 years ago and why it's still going on now and why my body's still behaving the way it is and what I can do about it. That obviously is not going to be this short-term fix because it's been going on for 20 or 30 years, but clearly there's something that's not been right between me and my body for 3 decades. And now how do I change that relationship, because I don't have a clue. And then I get a simplistic term from my provider and I go, they don't have a clue either.
Sarah, what you just said made me wonder something else. You said, well, I'm seeking an understanding, right? I wonder how often clinicians and patients understand each other's goals for an interaction, right? So I think particularly in a medical system where the clinician doesn't have their access needs met, they don't have a framework for that at all to begin with, but they're dysregulated, overburdened, overdrained. And there is this feeling, this limbic reaction to the idea that somebody wants something of me, from me. And often it's just not based in reality. The provider is not necessarily able to take in information about, actually, somebody just really wants to have a conversation sometimes about how this could be. We're not at a place where we're talking about, is this happening, right? We skip that part because the patient said it's happening. That's what's happening in their body. You get to actually skip that part. The patient wasn't actually asking, is this happening? It is happening, right? And so if you are at this place where the encounter becomes, well, is this happening? And I think that acute care is very much about, is this happening, right? So I have this thing, do I have this acute process? And there are tests and there are, imaging and there are this and there are that. You're testing for a particular thing. And if that thing is happening, you can maybe find a thing. When we're really talking about the chronic health conditions, the constellation of intertwined medical problems that autistic people commonly experience, we're not in that model. And I don't know that anybody's naming that.
Right. Yeah, I think that's so true, Mel. I think it's the question is more of it's something is happening. I might not have enough information to understand what is happening, but something is happening. There's something in the relationship with me and between my body and me that isn't working, that hasn't been working for a long time. I don't know how to fix it. And I need enough information. I need to understand what's going on in order to even begin to figure out how to fix it. And if you're not going to help me understand what's going on, if you're just going to say, well, I can throw a pill at this and then you won't notice it happening, that's not what I'm looking for. I mean, it's just, I want to know why this happens every time I garden. Yeah. Or why this happens every time I go to a family reunion. I need 3 weeks to recover and I can't get out of bed for the first 3 days and I can barely feed my cat. And, it's just what can I do differently? Or is there a way, is there hope to change this relationship with my body that clearly isn't working? And that's sort of the level of desperation that I'm in. And the doctor's looking at it in a totally different way.
It feels to me a lot of those issues are also compounded by this. We have these diagnostic tests, and for a lot of autistic folks, the results of that test may not align with what we expect to see on the results of those tests from medical knowledge or nursing knowledge or healthcare knowledge. And it seems we have this huge trust in these objective tests that we have over somebody's, objective tests that we have over somebody's experience and what they're telling us. And it seems for a lot of people, when the test is negative, that's the end. So it does not exist to the provider anymore. And we no longer care about really trying to support your symptoms or your experience or whatever you need support with because the test was negative.
Yeah. Right. And so in the setting of this constellation of intertwined neuroimmune conditions, when we order tests at All Brains Belong, for example, we try to really over the top counsel patients. We're expecting these tests to not show anything. There are not good tests that are going to show us stuff. When we find something, I'm going to celebrate because I've got a very clear thing that we've identified. We found, your B12 deficiency, or we found your thyroid thing or whatever. But that doesn't mean even if it came back normal, it doesn't mean you don't have either of those things or any of the other things that go into this constellation. And that's not something that most healthcare professionals get any training in, that they have any frame of reference for, that they would believe is true. But it is true. We've got a practice where 97% of the practice has this.
I think for a lot of the participants in this study, people talked about providers just sort of writing things off as being a weight-related issue. And the same was true for mental health, that if somebody went in with a known mental health diagnosis, it automatically put the provider in this context of, well, that's your mental health, and no longer seeking another layer of what's going on with this person. And we saw that a lot, both weight and mental health being these sort of distracting pieces of a conversation that weren't really relevant from the person's experience, but to the provider became just the answer and the end of the conversation.
And Zeph's got a hand up, and then I've got a thought on this too.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I don't think my concerns about the weight loss were taken seriously because I am obese.
And I also wonder if these both what we're calling weight issues and what we're calling obesity and what we're calling mental health issues aren't inextricably intertwined with the physical, with some other kind of a condition that is physiological, that is not showing up on tests. And so these things are a sign to look deeper, and that our medical knowledge needs to go deeper, that we're missing something, and there's something that we're not understanding about the way that both appetite and physiology of retaining of caloric energy processing is literally is somehow not is or isn't working in a human body, and how that affects both mood and other aspects of cognitive functioning, that then we just write off as, well, it's mental health, when in fact the moment we see mental health, we ought to be saying, oh my God, there's something going there, there's something happening.
I come at that from a little bit of the opposite direction, just to show the diversity of what happens out there. But when my symptoms of the functional neurological disorder started getting more extreme, I was talking with my mental health provider, and she was one of the people who really supported me in saying that, yes, there really is something going on with your body. I saw my first neurologist regarding some of these issues in 2016, and I was diagnosed with CPTSD, and no treatment except for sending me to the local mental health center, which was not prepared to deal with me. Moved out to Vermont, wound up seeing two neurologists. The first one diagnosed it as functional neurological disorder and told me to get counseling.
So this concept that mental health and physical health are in some ways separate is just so bogus. And this combination of all the things that would impact the nervous system, medications, supplements, adapting your environment and routines, nutrition. I mean, it's everything. But I think if it would be all right to even circle back to so we've got these big picture problems in the discipline of medicine or the domain of healthcare. But if we can circle back to the things that doctors say and do that is unhelpful, can we name some of those things that have come up in the research? Laura, is anything coming to mind of some of the things that people talked about? Because I think people have no idea. I think they would be surprised to be told that when they say, oh, you're suffering, and I make a comment right away about your weight, that they'd be surprised to hear that's not helpful and that's harmful, invalidating, that is resulting in the patient feeling bad. I think they would be surprised to hear that.
Yeah. And I think one that came up for a lot of people was that they felt that they had a need for information that was underestimated by the provider. And so if they said to the provider, I'm really concerned about this piece of my health, somebody talked, for example, about their height was changing. And I don't remember if it was getting taller or shorter, but they were, why is this happening? What's going on with my body? And the provider's, well, I wouldn't worry about that. And that was the end of it. And so it immediately gave the impression that the provider didn't care about them, or something that was important to them was immediately dismissed in their care. And I feel those were the kind of things that we were seeing where people really had this interest in wanting to know more about their bodies and wanting to learn what was going on with themselves and why they were having an experience. And when providers, I think from the nursing end, I suspect that many providers thought that would be helpful and reducing anxiety and just telling you not to worry about that. And really what it was doing was explaining, or not explaining, but showing people, I don't really care about that, without giving any explanation for why they're not concerned or what they suspect is going on that makes them immediately not concerned. And that was something we saw for a lot of people. And the interpretation was, my provider lacks curiosity. They're not trying to figure out the problem. They don't actually care about me. They don't believe me. When I suspect on the provider end, it was actually meant to be a reassurance, but it certainly wasn't.
I mean, that happens with so many things. And I think that even I was talking with someone yesterday about, why do providers tell parents who are wondering if their children are autistic? Why do providers tell parents, oh, don't worry? That's implying there's something to worry about. How about we just try to understand how my sweet little love's brain works, right?
Often the things that hurt the most are, I'll go in and I'll talk about something and so are you following up with your therapist? Are you taking your medications? And so it's what I'm hearing them saying is they're far more concerned about anything that's going on with me mental health wise than physical, and that they're not going to try very hard to do anything they're not going to be looking very closely or trying very hard because they've already drawn the conclusion that whatever's happening with me mental health wise is far more important than anything they can possibly see physically. And so our concerns aren't aligned. And then I also think that there's something about that piece that's very much reminiscent of what I get as an autistic person in the culture at large. It's that the things that I'm concerned about are the things I zoom in on, and maybe it's that I'm more detail oriented than the culture at large, or I guess it's reminiscent of what I see about social patterns where people are trying to be, I'm worried about how did I come across to somebody, or I'm worried about some social energy that I'm picking up on, and the person's going, don't worry about that. It's not a problem. It's not an issue. And then 3 months later, the thing that I was worried about is blown up and I'm fired from a job, or the person's not talking to me, or, so the provider is really providing a reassurance that I have learned not to trust, because what other people think isn't worrisome, I have learned is actually worrisome from a point of my survival socially. And then when it blows up, I also get blamed because, obviously there must be something that was wrong because nobody else saw it coming. And so anyway, so I'll stop there.
That's really important, and really important that we name that when someone says that they are concerned about something and the professional, you name two things. So one, anything pertaining to a lens of mental health is implying to the person that you are not thinking about the rest of their physical health, because it's already been made really clear that you're thinking about those things separately. And I would imagine that what related to that would be how many people told us that their provider talks about, well, tell me about your stress. Talking about stress, I mean, yes, we are impacted by physiologic stress from, even, physically exerting ourselves. Our mitochondria aren't using energy appropriately. But anyway, stress has connotations. And it's greatly implied that you're not aligned, as I think Sarah said really well. Laura, what were you going to say?
Well, I think the other thing that you touched on when you started that, Sarah, is questioning your compliance with the treatment plan, and that the questions become about, well, are you taking the meds? And almost this questioning of what you're reporting as being the problem is the way you're doing the treatment plan, not that the treatment plan doesn't work for you or that we're looking in the wrong direction. And I think that we saw a lot of that in our interviews too, that people really felt the continual questioning of whether you were following things in the correct way. And it comes back to, Sarah, that blame piece, that it ultimately is on you. The way that you were following the plan is the problem, instead of the plan is the problem.
We're going to take a pause at the end of part 1 here. I need to say these stories are hard to hear because they're true. As patients, so many of us have lived them. As clinicians, we can see the ways in which the system sets us up for these things. The patterns aren't random. The system is working exactly as it was built, and that's the problem. So in part 2, we return to look at what can shift, not to offer false hope, but to explore what becomes possible when someone believes you. We hope we'll listen. If you want to keep exploring with us, you can join our live Brain Club events most Tuesdays at 6 p.m. Eastern. You can also dig into our free digital resource library with all the recordings from the past 4 years at allbrainsbelong.org. You're not alone, and we're glad you're here. See you next time.